Have you ever imagined discovering, on the very day you reaffirm the love of your life before God and others, that it was all a big lie? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to renew your vows at the altar, thrilled, believing you were living a dream, only to realize the person beside you is hiding a secret capable of destroying not only your marriage, but also your faith, your identity, and even your self-confidence? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 41 years old, and today I want to open my heart to share the most difficult part of my story. For a long time, my life seemed perfect to others. I was a devoted wife, active in church, with a marriage that many held up as an example. I believed I had built a home on rock, guided by the principles of the Christian faith, and I dreamed of being living proof that God unites two people forever. But what I didn't know was that, while I was striving to be a faithful and submissive wife, the man I shared my life with was building a parallel reality, a secret life, another family. Has anyone else here experienced this? Have you ever felt the weight of carrying alone a pain you didn't dare share with anyone, afraid of judgment, afraid of not being believed, even afraid of being accused of a lack of faith? I know what it's like. At first, the signs were small, disguised: work excuses, church commitments, unexpected trips, and I kept quiet about my suspicions because I always heard, pray, more, trust, be patient. With each imposed silence, I became a little more self-effacing. Trust me, what I'm about to reveal will leave you speechless. Because it's not just a story of betrayal or abandonment, but of how a Christian woman was silenced within the very space where she should have found shelter and protection. And it all began to crumble on the very day I believed I was experiencing the greatest celebration of my marriage. Warning, this revelation isn't easy to hear, but it can change the way you see love, faith, and even yourself. And it was at that very moment that my life split in two. Very few people know what happened, but perhaps what I'm about to tell will help other women not feel alone. Because behind every smile I wore on Sunday, there was a silent storm that no one imagined. The truth is, when you live in a church marriage, the expectations are sky high. Perfection, a testimony of faith, and unwavering patience are expected. And when something goes wrong, the blame almost always falls on the woman. I felt this every day, as if I were on a stage, playing a role that wasn't mine. On the outside, everything seemed stable. On the inside, I was falling apart. And it's curious how we learn to silence our own intuitions. How many times did my heart scream that something was wrong? How many nights did I spend waiting for him to return, believing the excuses of long meetings, urgent trips, last-minute calls? I repeated to myself, be understanding. Don't question, trust. This mentality of blind submission became a prison. And the most painful thing is that it didn't come from God, but from people who used faith as a crutch to perpetuate a system of silence. Behind the scenes of my marriage, there were clear signs: averted glances, deleted messages, apologies that didn't add up. But I clung to the dream of family, to the image we'd built together. After all, who would believe me if I aroused suspicion? Who would listen to my voice against his impeccable reputation? It was as if there was a hidden truth that only I saw, but no one wanted to admit. This feeling of living a lie consumed me, but at the same time, I didn't have the courage to face the impact that the revelation could have. And therein lies the trap. When you choose to close your eyes for fear of the consequences, you already begin to lose yourself. I found myself trapped in a narrative of the perfect wife, but each decision to remain silent meant a piece of me was lost. What no one knew was that my body reacted before my mind. Pain, insomnia, anxiety attacks that I masked with smiles and memorized verses. Inside, my spirit cried out for freedom, but my mouth remained closed. Has anyone else ever experienced this feeling of being an outsider in their own life? It's like being in a movie where everyone knows the script except you. The fear of discovering the truth mixed with the fear of continuing to live a lie. And between these two anxieties, I chose to pretend. Because believing the pretty version was less painful than staring into the abyss. But there's something even more essential here, something few realize. I met Michael when I was still young, inside the church. He was the kind of person who seemed to shine in any setting, always smiling, willing to help, respected by all. The women in the congregation called him a role model. The leaders pointed to him as someone with a promising future, and I, with the naivety of someone who believed. In fairy tales, thought I had found the man God had in store for me. It was impossible not to be drawn to his confident demeanor, his words filled with conviction, and the image of a Christian of integrity he projected. In the background of my memory, I recall how every detail seemed to fit together: the gatherings after services, the conversations filled with verses, the looks that conveyed the promise of eternity. The impact of his presence on my life was immediate. I came from a family that always taught me to value marriage, covenants, and fidelity, and when I heard him speak the same words, I felt as if everything made sense. It was as if God had answered my prayers. The mindset I carried at the time was simple. If he was so loved and respected by everyone, if he preached about truth, character, and commitment, then I could give him my heart without reservation. And that's exactly what I did. The journey began with small tokens of affection, letters, gestures of care, plans for the future. His every word seemed to shape my hope. I felt chosen, special, as if I had been set apart to live a story of love and faith alongside someone who shared the same values. People would say, "You two were made for each other," and I believed it deeply. This kind of external approval reinforced my decisions, as if every step I took with him was confirmed by the gaze of others. But the hidden truth is that what appears perfect in front of a crowd doesn't always correspond to what happens in silence. Looking back now, I realize there were small signs of control, moments when his attention seemed more intense than necessary, almost as if he were constructing an image too flawless to be real. But back then, I didn't see it. I was in love, blinded by hope, and I believed every promise made. The impact of this idealized beginning was that I surrendered myself without barriers. There was no room for doubt, no filter, and when you build your life on blind trust, any crack has the power to destroy not only the relationship, but also your very identity. What I didn't know is that the glow that enchanted me at the altar of youth hid hidden secrets I never imagined I'd face. And it was precisely there that the greatest turnaround of my life began to unfold. I remember how, back then, I believed I was living a gift from God, a flawless beginning, as if my story was destined to be an example for other women in the church. And perhaps that's why sharing this with you now is so important, because I know many experience something similar in silence, swallowing doubts, believing they are the only ones feeling this mix of love and insecurity. That's why this space here isn't just mine, it's ours. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated with you most, because your voice could be exactly the support another woman needs today. And if you want to continue following honest stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also need to hear this kind of message. This is how we can create a true community, where each story transforms into healing, strength, and hope. And as I share every detail of my journey, I know this connection we're building could be the beginning of something much bigger than just a video, because every revelation, every memory I share opens the door for us to understand that we're not alone. And it was precisely in this certainty of being surrounded by attentive eyes that I began to notice the first cracks hidden behind the perfect smile he showed the world. I believed, with all my heart, that we were building a solid family, centered on God and the Christian faith. With every service we attended together, with every prayer we shared before bed, I felt as if we were planting deep roots in fertile soil. I dreamed of having children who would grow up seeing the example of their parents united, steadfast in the Word, being a light to others. I imagined our home filled with laughter, gospel music playing in the background, and conversations around the table about divine promises. This was the picture I painted in my mind, and I believed we were heading in exactly that direction. It was like living a perfect life script, but without realizing that, behind the scenes, something wasn't quite right. The mentality that those who serve God are protected from all harm left me vulnerable, because I believed that prayer and trust alone were enough to ward off any threat. I clung to this certainty like someone holding onto a plank in the middle of the ocean. Every decision I made revolved around this unshakable family ideal, where there was patience, faith, and forgiveness. Everything would work out. Over time, I began to realize that the impact of this dream wasn't just mine. The people around us also projected expectations onto us. I heard phrases like, "You're an inspiration," "Your marriage shows," "The power of God." And these words, instead of strengthening me, created an invisible weight. It was as if my life wasn't just my own, but a stage on which I needed to maintain my image intact. This made me stifle any doubts, because admitting a flaw would be admitting that the entire ideal was crumbling. The curious thing is that, even when faced with small revelations that could have alerted me, I convinced myself it was part of the journey. A constant delay, a prolonged absence, messages that couldn't be explained. I told myself, this is normal. Every couple goes through this. It was easier to believe this pretty version than to confront the hidden truth knocking at the door. And so, while I nurtured my dream of a perfect family, I ignored that the cracks were already there, silent but about to become visible. This unshakable belief that love covered all made me blind to the danger. I didn't realize that sometimes misinterpreted faith can become a blindfold. And it was in this mixture of hope and blindness that I continued to nurture the idea that we were building an indestructible home, never imagining that the greatest revelation of my life was ever closer. At the altar, when I heard his last name join mine, Emily Carter Williams, it felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. I remember the feeling of living the pinnacle of my story, as if every step up to that point had been written to culminate in that moment. The flowers, the hymns, the intertwined hands, the guests' emotional looks. Everything seemed too perfect to question. I smiled like someone who had found paradise on earth. The impact of that moment was so powerful that for a long time, it served as fuel to ignore any shadows that might arise later. I told myself, if God brought us together like this, nothing can separate us. From that moment on, every detail of our wedding became a symbol. The ring on our left hand, our shared surname, the photographs capturing our everlasting smiles. Everything reinforced the idea that we were destined to live a lifetime together. Behind the scenes, however, there were already signs of discomfort. Sometimes, a distant look, a prolonged silence, or a vague justification pierced me like tiny needles. But I quickly convinced myself it was nothing more than an exaggeration on my part. After all, who would doubt a man who, in front of so many, promised eternal love at the altar? It's curious how mindset shapes how we interpret reality. I saw him as a spiritual leader, an admired husband, a role model within the church, and so I left no room for questioning. The decision I made at that altar didn't seem just a personal choice, but a pact before everyone, a responsibility I had to bear, no matter the cost. This belief prevented me from seeing the hidden truth hidden behind the impeccable image he projected. There were days when I felt a strange distance, as if he were with me physically, but my mind wandered elsewhere. And yet, instead of confronting it, I embraced the illusion even more tightly. This was the power of the dream I nurtured, transforming fissures into mere details and keeping the narrative of perfection intact. With every wedding anniversary, with every symbolic gesture, I relived that moment at the altar, as if it were enough to erase any doubt. The impact this had on my journey was profound. I became an expert at silencing internal questions, at stifling emotions that didn't fit the version I wanted to believe. The small revelations that emerged were treated as coincidences, never as warnings. I was so focused on keeping the fairy tale alive that I didn't realize the weight of the choices I made daily. It was a silent transformation, from a conscious and sensitive woman to someone who accepted living on the surface, lacking the courage to dive into the deep waters of reality. And it was precisely in this scenario, amidst eternal promises and carefully constructed dreams, that the first cracks began to widen in a way that could no longer be ignored. He was away a lot, and I always believed his explanations. Work, ministry, church commitments, it all sounded coherent. After all, he'd always been very active and involved in various areas. To any outsider, It seemed natural that he was constantly busy, but inside me, something began to sound different. Small, almost imperceptible details stirred a restlessness that I tried to silence with prayer. Schedules that didn't fit, messages that arrived at unusual times, prolonged absences that didn't fit with the routine of someone who claimed to be so committed to faith. I remember one particular night when he said he had a long meeting and ended up returning late. When I asked how it had gone, his answer was vague, accompanied by a distant look, as if he were trying to end the conversation before it even began. My heart pounded suspiciously, but my peace at all costs mentality kept me backing away. I convinced myself that asking too many questions was a lack of trust, and that trust was the foundation of a marriage. And so, once again, I drowned out that inner voice telling me to pay attention to the signs. Behind the scenes of my life, this choice to remain silent had a greater impact than I realized. I believed I was protecting my marriage, but in practice, I was creating a space where the hidden truth could grow freely. Each time I chose to believe without question, I reinforced a dynamic that distanced me from myself. It was as if my decisions were shaped not by reality, but by the fear of what I might discover. And in the process, I gradually lost clarity. Those around us still saw us as the perfect couple. "You're an inspiration," they'd say. I smiled and thanked them, but deep down, I felt something wasn't quite right. This discrepancy between what I showed and what I felt silently gnawed at me. The journey that should have been one of love and growth began to become a struggle against my own intuition. Because if I dared admit something was wrong, I'd have to deal with the devastating impact of realizing that my dream of a solid family might just be an illusion. And so it was, between seemingly plausible excuses and heavy silences, that I began to collect signs that didn't make sense. I still tried to believe that everything would work out, that it was just a phase of hard work and dedication. But deep down, a part of me already knew that those moments of absence weren't just external commitments. There was something behind it, something still hidden, about to reveal itself in a way that was impossible to ignore. And I believed. Because who would distrust a man everyone called an example of faith? Blind trust became almost a law within me, and it was sustained not only by what I saw in him, but by what everyone around me reinforced. Church leaders, friends, even my own family praised his attitude, highlighted his involvement, his dedication, and this created a kind of armor within me against any suspicion. I thought, if so many people admire him, if he inspires so many, then the problem must lie with me, with my distorted perception, with my insecurities. This kind of mindset has a silent impact because it undermines the ability to question, to see clearly. Every time a strange detail emerged, I remembered some compliment he'd received and immediately dismissed my doubts. It was as if the hidden truth was there, right before my eyes, but I myself chose not to see it. This was the most dangerous decision I ever made without realizing it, to remain silent in the face of signs, believing that faith required absolute trust. Behind the scenes, I found myself making excuses for every absence. He's serving, he's tired, he's overwhelmed. And when someone commented that I was lucky to have such a devoted husband, I'd smile and reply that I truly felt blessed. It was as if I were acting out a role, trapped in a narrative that couldn't be interrupted. This journey of self-deception became burdensome because while I maintained the image of the perfect marriage, my heart carried a growing restlessness. The curious thing is how the mind finds ways to silence the heart. I remembered biblical passages about submission, trust, and love that endures all things, and used them as arguments against my own perceptions. Instead of seeking balance, I sank into a pattern of denial that took me further and further away from reality. And so, trapped between his impeccable image and my need to believe, I continued living as if nothing were wrong. This blind trust, which seemed like a virtue, was actually the lens that prevented me from seeing the depth of the cracks that were already opening before me. I didn't know it yet, but this choice to believe without question was about to push me to the breaking point, where the revelations would come with enough force to shake everything I had built up until then. When I considered sharing my insecurities, I heard, "Pray more, be strong, don't question your husband." This phrase, which seemed like advice, fell on me like a weight, pushing me further into silence. Instead of being a welcoming space, the community I loved so much became a stage for criticism. I couldn't show weakness because weakness was seen as a lack of faith. I couldn't express my doubts because doubting was almost a sin. So I learned to swallow my tears and smile as if I were living the same perfect life others believed I saw. The impact of this silencing was devastating, but also subtle. Little by little, I began to believe that my pain was irrelevant, that my perceptions were worthless. I convinced myself that being a Christian woman meant carrying any burden in silence, without complaining, without exposing, without disturbing the image everyone had of us. And this mindset corroded my identity from within, like a slow flame that consumes without fanfare. Behind the scenes, my mind was waging constant battles. I wondered, am I being overly assertive? Was it just my insecurity? With every attempt to speak, with every attempt to open my heart, the same answer always came. Be submissive. Pray more. God will do the rest. It was as if my voice had no legitimacy, as if questioning meant failing not only as a wife, but also as a Christian. This confusion between faith and silence trapped me in a cycle with no way out. And the most painful thing was feeling that the community, which should be a space for transformation, ended up reinforcing a system of concealment. I was there, surrounded by people, but I felt alone. As the internal revelations began to weigh more heavily, I realized it wasn't just a marriage in crisis, but something much bigger, a pattern of decisions that maintained the facade and prevented any hidden truth from coming to light. The impact of this external pressure drove me further away from reality. I maintained the image of the ideal wife while my heart emptied. And the more I remained silent, the harder it became to distinguish between genuine intuition and mere fear. The journey that seemed like one of faith and surrender was turning into a prison disguised as devotion. I didn't know it yet, but this imposed silence would be one of the cruelest pieces of the plot that would lead to my collapse. And it was at that point that I realized it wasn't just his absence that hurt me, but also the lack of listening in the place where I most hoped to be heard. I already felt guilty for distrusting him, as if I were the sinner in the story. It was a silent but constant weight that accompanied my every thought. Whenever doubt arose in my heart, I immediately felt as if I was betraying his trust simply by questioning him. I didn't need anyone to point the finger at me because I already carried the accusation within myself. The mindset that a wife should be the guardian of peace in the home led me to believe that if something was wrong, it was because I wasn't praying enough, wasn't being patient enough, wasn't living up to God's expectations. This distortion kept me paralyzed. While he built the image of an exemplary man, I struggled with a guilt that grew with each passing day. And the cruelest part is that when I finally summoned the courage to share my feelings with a few people close to me, seeking advice or even understanding, I received disapproving looks. Subtle comments like, "Don't be negative," or "Trust is the foundation of everything," reinforced the idea that the fault lay within me, in my perception. It was as if the community had become a mirror that returned only judgment. And this reflection made me believe that perhaps I was overreacting, creating problems where none existed. Behind the scenes of my mind, confusion was intense. I vacillated between believing in the love we shared at the altar and questioning the signs that kept appearing before me. Every inner revelation was stifled by the need to maintain an image, to not disappoint those who saw us as an example. The impact of this on my emotional journey was profound, because it wasn't just about my marriage, but about my identity as a woman of faith. I asked myself, is my spirituality weak? Am I not knowing how to trust God? This kind of thinking eroded my self-esteem and pushed me further and further away from the hidden truth that lurked behind his behavior. External pressure compounded internal pressure, creating an almost unbearable burden. I no longer knew if my silence was a choice or an imposition. Judgment came from all sides, from others, from my own conscience, and even from the way I interpreted my faith. It was like being trapped in a web where every move made me feel even guiltier. And so, between blame and justification, I continued to live a role that no longer suited me, until the cracks became impossible to hide, and the mask we wear in public began to reveal flaws that could no longer be ignored. After years of marriage, he suggested we renew our vows at the altar. It was moving, almost like reliving the day it all began. The church was lit up, the people gathered, and I felt a wave of hope wash over me, as if the ceremony were confirmation that we were on the right path. When he spoke about the importance of reaffirming our commitment before God and the community, my heart filled with gratitude. I thought, maybe I've exaggerated my insecurities. Maybe this is all just the normal phases of a long-term relationship. In that moment, the idea of transformation felt real, as if we were ready for a fresh start full of purpose. His words sounded convincing, and his careful gestures seemed sincere. When we looked into each other's eyes and repeated vows of love and fidelity, I believed I was being given a new chance, an unexpected gift. The impact of that moment was so strong that it drowned out any memory of distrust. It felt like the cracks had been healed, that the turbulent backstage had finally quieted. I felt once, again, part of a beautiful story capable of inspiring other couples. That day, as we walked out of the church hand in hand, people hugged us and congratulated us, and I smiled as if I'd been healed of all my doubts. There was something almost magical about that atmosphere, as if a new page had been turned. The guilty mindset that had plagued me for years seemed to have dissolved. I allowed myself to believe that I'd been wrong all along, that my heart had been deceived, and that the truth was simply the renewed love we'd celebrated in front of everyone. But the curious thing is that, amidst so much emotion, there were details that didn't match the perfect image I wanted to believe. A distant look that would slip away for a few seconds, a strange rush to end certain conversations, or even a restlessness disguised as emotion. I noticed it, but immediately decided to ignore it. After all, who would question a man who had just reaffirmed his vows before God? I chose, once again, to believe the prettiest version of the story, because it was less painful than facing the possibility of a hidden truth. This ceremony, which was supposed to be simply a milestone of love, ended up becoming a turning point in my journey. I didn't know it yet, but that decision to hold on to what seemed perfect would be the trigger for revelations that would change everything. What seemed like a happy ending was, in reality, just the prelude to a profound impact that was about to unfold. I felt like the most blessed woman in the world, enveloped in a celebratory atmosphere that seemed to touch every part of my soul. The people smiling, the warm hugs, the looks that spoke without words of how special this moment was. It was as if all the weight of the previous years had been erased, and in its place was only hope and renewal. I walked out of the church feeling as if a new cycle had begun, convinced that God had answered my prayers, but I didn't know that that very day my life would fall apart. The contrast between what I felt and what I was about to discover is something that still gives me chills to this day. There's a cruel irony in believing you're living the pinnacle of your story, while, behind the scenes, everything is already crumbling. This is the hardest part to accept, the realization that while I wept with emotion before the altar, a hidden truth was preparing to surface and completely change the course of my journey. As everyone celebrated, I watched my husband, surrounded by praise, handshakes, and declarations of admiration. He seemed comfortable in his exemplary position, as if every word he heard was fuel to further fuel the impeccable image he'd always cultivated. I was proud of him, and in a way, I felt that this recognition was mine too, as if we were reaping the rewards of our decision to remain steadfast together. But there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a strange, almost imperceptible glint, as if he carried a secret that couldn't be shared. That night, lying beside him, I felt a mixture of peace and unease. The peace came from the dream I believed I was living. The unease arose from an emptiness I couldn't explain. It was as if my body sensed something my mind couldn't yet comprehend. The blind trust that had guided me until then was no longer enough to completely silence the doubts that arose in small flashes, like glimpses of revelations that insisted on appearing. The transformation that day was twofold. On the outside, a celebration of renewed love. On the inside, the beginning of a silent battle between the version I wanted to believe and the truth that was beginning to creep in. I didn't yet know that, In a matter of hours, the first cracks would become an abyss impossible to ignore, and that the story I defended so devotedly was about to be shattered in ways I could never have imagined. Shortly after the ceremony, with the dress still in a box and my heart full of emotions, my phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it, not imagining that those words would change everything. I read slowly, in disbelief. "Jessica, open your eyes. Michael has another family." The shock was so great that for a moment I thought it was some kind of mistake. But the message was clear, direct, impossible to interpret any other way. My mind refused to accept it. The contrast between the celebration at the altar and that unexpected revelation was brutal, as if two opposite worlds collided within me. In the following seconds, my breath became shallow, my body froze, and I felt as if the ground had cracked open. How could anyone dare send something like that? Who would want to destroy such a special moment? At the same time, an inner voice whispered, "What if it's not a lie? What if this is the truth you never wanted to see?" The struggle between blindly trusting and facing the possibility of betrayal began to rage within me, and each word of that message echoed like thunder. The emotional impact was devastating. I wanted to dismiss it immediately, erase it, pretend I'd never read it. But the words were etched, not just on my phone screen, but in my mind. It was as if everything I'd chosen to ignore until then had finally found a way to manifest itself. An anonymous revelation, yes, but one that carried with it the weight of something I'd already sensed. The transformation didn't happen slowly. It was a sudden jolt, a sudden drop in my journey. While everyone was still celebrating the supposed new beginning, I was already waging an internal battle. My mind swirled with unanswered questions. Was it true? Was someone jealous of us and trying to destroy us? Should I confront them right then and there? With each hypothesis, I felt my heart race, as if facing a definitive choice. The decision to believe or investigate seemed to determine the course of my entire life. And even as I tried to calm myself, the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. I began to observe the details around me with new eyes, his every gesture, every silence, every short answer. It was as if the message had lifted a curtain, and now I could see behind the scenes of a spectacle that no longer seemed so convincing. I knew that from then on, nothing would be the same. The seed of doubt had been planted, and its presence was too strong to ignore. I held the phone for long minutes, unable to react. The hall still echoed with congratulatory voices, laughter, and soft music, but inside me, everything was silent. It was as if the world had frozen. The message seemed to pulse before my eyes, reminding me that perhaps the whole celebration was nothing more than a facade. I wanted to believe it was a lie, that someone jealous had made it up, but the feeling in my chest was different, that something much bigger and darker was about to be revealed. It's curious how sometimes all it takes is a single sentence to completely transform the way we view our lives. From that moment on, every memory began to resurface. Every detail took on new meaning, and the blind trust I'd always harbored seemed to shatter little by little. I didn't know if I was ready to face the truth, but I already understood that ignoring it would no longer be possible. And that's why I want to open my heart to you, listening now. If this topic resonates with you, please like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also need to hear real stories like this. When you like, you not only support my work, but also help this message reach other women who may be experiencing something similar in silence. It's like turning on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, someone realizes they're not alone. As I held that phone, my heart torn between belief and denial, I realized the message wasn't just about my marriage. It was about an entire life built on an image. And in that moment, for the first time, I faced the possibility that everything I believed I was signing at the altar might just be an illusion about to crumble. My entire body trembled. It was as if my heart had stopped for a few seconds, as if the blood had drained from my veins, leaving only an unbearable emptiness within me. The message still shone on the screen, and I read and reread it, trying to find some error, some flaw that would convince me it was just a malicious lie. But there was no room for illusions. Those words were direct, sharp, impossible to ignore. A mixture of fear, disbelief, and despair gripped me. The world around me continued at the same pace, but something inside me had broken irreversibly. It's strange how, in moments like these, the mind begins to split between two paths. Part of me screamed to erase that message, pretend I'd never read it, and continue living the comfortable version of the story. Another part, deeper and perhaps wiser, demanded that I face reality, that I have the courage to seek the hidden truth that until then I insisted on denying. It was in this internal conflict that I understood that my journey would never be the same. Blind trust was over, and now the only way out was to discover for myself the depth of those revelations. From that moment on, everything that once seemed normal took on new meaning. The nights he claimed to be in meetings, the sudden trips, the heavy silences, every detail became potential evidence. The transformation that took place within me was painful but necessary. I stopped being just the devoted wife who accepted superficial explanations and became a woman determined to uncover the hidden depths of her own life. I discreetly began to observe more closely, to note schedules, to notice small changes in his behavior. I no longer accepted vague answers as I had before. Every sentence was analyzed, every gesture weighed with suspicion. The impact of this was devastating, because at the same time I sought the truth, I also lost the lightness, the peace that had previously sustained my routine. It was as if I were living in a minefield, where every step could lead me to a revelation capable of destroying everything. The initial shock gave way to a phase of difficult decisions. I knew I needed proof. I needed to be certain before any confrontation. Because this wasn't just a suspicion, but the possibility that my entire life was being built on a lie. The mindset of trusting without question was long gone, and now I was heading toward unknown territory, where each discovery brought me closer to the inevitable. I still didn't know how I would proceed, but I was determined. The search for the truth had just begun. I began to investigate silently, like someone walking down a dark corridor, unsure of what might lie behind the next door. At first, I even doubted my courage. It was as if part of me wanted to give up and pretend nothing was happening, but another, firmer and more determined part no longer accepted, living with unanswered questions. And it was this part that prevailed. I needed to face it, to discover if that message was just a cruel trap or if it truly concealed a hidden truth capable of destroying everything I believed in. I began to observe every detail with almost obsessive attention. The time he arrived, the excuses that sounded rehearsed, the calls he only answered when he was gone. With each step, with each small sign, suspicion grew within me like a flame difficult to control, until the moment came when simply observing was no longer enough. I needed proof. And so, with my heart racing and my hands trembling, I began to search for the traces he left behind. It wasn't long before the first revelations emerged. Photos that made no sense, messages exchanged at suspicious times, documents that proved hidden movements in my routine. With each discovery, it was as if a new layer of my life was being peeled back, revealing behind-the-scenes details I never imagined existed. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't my own exaggeration. It was real, and this realization had a devastating impact. The mindset of complete trust I'd always carried transformed into a kind of painful vigilance. I now saw myself as a detective in my own story, piecing together fragments that, when fitted together, formed a picture too dark to ignore. The transformation was inevitable. I stopped being the woman who lived only by what she was told and became the one who needed to see with her own eyes, even if it cost me my peace. With each new test, the feeling of betrayal grew, and with it, the need to make decisions. The silence became unbearable, because within me the truth was already screaming too loudly. And even though fear surrounded me, there was no turning back. I was ready to face the revelations that were yet to come, even without imagining where they might lead me. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. It wasn't just a betrayal. It wasn't just a well-told lie. It was an entire double life, built in the shadow of what I believed to be true. Another house, another wife, other children. Suddenly, everything I considered solid was revealed as a stage set, where I was playing a role without even knowing it was part of a parallel script. The impact of this was brutal. There was no way to simply take a deep breath and move on. It was an emotional breakdown in its purest form. With each new revelation, my body responded as if at war with itself. My heart raced, my hands sweated, my legs trembled uncontrollably. It was like carrying a storm inside my chest, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and pain that couldn't find a place to settle. And yet, amidst this maelstrom, a hidden truth began to form in my mind. I could no longer hide behind naivete. I had to face what was before me, even if it cost me more tears than I thought I could shed. The nights became too long, filled with thoughts that came and went like violent waves. I relived every scene, every gesture, every word he said, trying to piece together the pieces and understand when the signs became clear and I chose not to see them. It was painful to admit that, at times, my own mindset had contributed to that deception, because I chose to believe what comforted me, rather than what my intuition was already whispering softly. This revelation shook me even more deeply, because it showed me that the transformation I needed was not just external, but internal. It felt like I'd lived in such a well-crafted illusion that it seemed impossible not to have noticed. And perhaps that's what hurts most in situations like this, the realization that you trusted blindly and in the end found yourself facing a truth you never wanted to see. The tears were accompanied by a strange force, as if the suffering itself opened space for a new kind of awareness. It was devastating, but it also carried a potential for change that I couldn't ignore. Amidst the chaos, I realized that this emotional breakdown wasn't just destruction. It was also a breaking point, a watershed that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The pain consumed me, but with it came a new clarity about the decisions I needed to make, about the paths that lay ahead. It was like walking through a dark tunnel, knowing that each step brought me closer to an exit, even though I had no idea what the light that awaited me beyond would look like. I remember the scene as if it had happened yesterday. The silence in the house seemed heavier than ever, and the air was permeated with that mixture of tension and fear that precedes something inevitable. When I finally summoned my courage, I looked into his eyes and with a choked voice asked the question that had been gnawing at me. "Is it true?" Seconds that felt like hours passed, until he looked away, took a deep breath, and simply said, "You wouldn't understand." That sentence was like a cold blade piercing my chest. It wasn't an answer. It was an escape, a wall erected between us, an attempt to reduce me to someone incapable of comprehending the magnitude of his choices. In that moment, I felt like my entire life had been upended. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore, but about the way he tried to silence me, as if my pain were too small to be heard, as if my mind couldn't handle the truth. And it's precisely this kind of manipulation that leaves even deeper scars, because besides deceiving, it seeks to nullify our perception, our strength, our identity. It was a direct attack on my mentality, as if he wanted to convince me I had no right to seek answers. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss. I just stood there, motionless, watching the man I thought I knew transform into a stranger before my eyes. There was something behind the scenes of that double life that I still didn't understand, but a certainty was beginning to grow within me. I would no longer be complicit in silence. The impact of that confrontation wasn't just in confirming my suspicions, but in realizing how much I had underestimated my own intuition. Every hidden detail, every half-truth, now became part of a puzzle I needed to piece together, even if it meant facing painful revelations. The pain was immense, but with it came an unexpected strength. It was as if, upon hearing those cold words, something had awakened within me. It wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the journey I would need to take to reclaim my voice, my clarity, and my freedom. This transformation wouldn't be simple, because it would require radical decisions, the courage to face hidden truths, and the willingness to break the cycle of illusions in which I was trapped. Deep down, I knew this was just the first step in a much larger battle, where each choice would define not only the course of my story, but also how I would see myself from then on. It was at that moment that reality fell upon me with an almost unbearable weight. His words still echoed, but they were no longer the only pain. What consumed me was the feeling of being alone on a battlefield, as if all the love, all the years shared, Every promise whispered in my ear had evaporated without a trace. Suddenly, I, Emily Carter Williams, was no longer a wife. He was just disposable. Not a life partner, but a silent replacement, without warning, without dignity. The brutality of this discovery plunged me into a void that cannot be explained with words. It was like walking through a labyrinth, with no exit, where every memory that should have warmed me burned. I tried to breathe deeply, but the air felt too dense, as if each breath were a reminder of what I had lost. The walls of the house, once a scene of laughter, conversation, and plans, now watched me like cold witnesses to an abandonment that was not only physical, but also emotional. The impact was not only the betrayal itself, but the annulment of my existence within his life. The invisibility was more painful than the lie. Suddenly, everything I thought solid seemed made of glass, and every gesture, every word I remembered, shattered into fragments impossible to piece together. The feeling of abandonment is devastating because it robs you not only of the person you believed you had by your side, but also of the security of being seen, recognized, and loved. I wondered how anyone could build a parallel life without even hesitating, without measuring the impact it would have. The cruelest thing wasn't the existence of another family, but the coldness with which he marginalized me, as if I were merely an irrelevant detail, as if all my dedication had been in vain. This hidden truth I now carried on my shoulders forced me to reevaluate my own mindset, because deep down, I knew that, even in the face of chaos, I would have to choose whether to remain trapped in the role of victim or find the strength to reframe that pain. It was strange to realize that, even as I felt destroyed, a silent movement of transformation was already beginning to take place within me. The pain made me see nuances I'd previously ignored, revelations hidden behind routine that now gained clearer contours. The journey of reconstruction wasn't limited to overcoming abandonment, but to learning to recognize myself again outside its shadow. Because as disposable as I felt at that moment, there was an inner flame that insisted on not fading, a reminder that I still had choices, that my decisions could reshape not only my present, but also the impact I would have on my own history. And it was in this whirlwind of feelings that I realized the void he left was not just an end, but also an open space, fertile ground for something new, even though I didn't know what would come next. When I finally mustered the courage to reveal the truth, I thought I would find acceptance, open arms ready to support me in the face of such cruel pain. I believed the community, which for years presented itself as a spiritual family, would be a refuge amidst the chaos. But what I found was different. The words that came instead of comfort cut like sharp blades. Maybe you weren't the woman he needed. This phrase remained etched like a permanent echo within me, because it not only minimized the betrayal, but also shifted onto me a guilt that wasn't mine. It was as if, besides being betrayed, I was being put on trial, judged for not having been enough. It was strange to realize how those who preached unconditional love and compassion were the same ones who now regarded me with suspicion, as if I had failed in something so essential that it justified abandonment. That veiled judgment carried a greater weight than the silence itself. Silence at least leaves room for interpretation, but words, when spoken coldly, have the power to forge deep scars. It was in that moment that I realized that the hidden truth within certain institutions is not so different from the lies that destroy homes. Both hide behind beautiful speeches, a reality rife with distortions. I scanned the faces around me, searching for some kind of empathetic look, but what I saw were expressions laden with expectation, as if they were waiting for a confession from me, an admission that I truly could have done more, loved more, endured more. This mentality, that a woman must always carry the cross alone, made me question not only the decisions I'd made for years, but also the underpinnings of everything I believed in. The impact of these words didn't stop at the surface. It pierced me, dismantling my sense of belonging and leaving me faced with a bitter revelation. I couldn't count on the support I'd so desperately hoped for. It was in this space of rejection, disguised as advice, that I realized how much we need to open our eyes to the power of narratives, because words, when used unconsciously, have the power to imprison. And there, faced with that reaction, I understood that it wasn't just the loss of a marriage I was facing, but also the need to break free from a structure that perpetuated invisible guilt. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about me and how I would deal with the truth that now pulsed before me. And as I digested each of these cutting sentences, something inside me began to move, as if the pain was slowly being replaced by a raw force, difficult to explain, but impossible to contain. I remember the moment when, alone in my room, the only thing left was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to amplify the emptiness within me. It was then that the hardest questions began to echo. They weren't superficial doubts, but cries of someone who felt shattered inside. Why? Where was the Lord when my life was falling apart? These words came out of my mouth through tears, not as an act of rebellion, but as a desperate cry for meaning. After all, if all my life I had believed in the promise of care and protection, how could I accept that in my darkest moment I was completely alone? The crisis wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. And this kind of shock goes beyond description. I felt like all the pillars I'd been supported by were crumbling simultaneously. Faith, once the flame that illuminated every decision, now felt like a nearly extinguished ember, incapable of warmth, incapable of sustaining. The hidden truth that emerged was that, deep down, I feared that this entire path of devotion had been in vain, as if my journey had been built on a promise that had crumbled before my eyes. And it was at that moment that loneliness took on a new dimension. It was no longer just the absence of the man I loved, nor just the rejection of the community that judged me, but the feeling that even the sky had fallen silent. It was like crossing an endless desert, where every step hurt and every sigh was too heavy. I searched for signs, small answers hidden in the shadows of everyday life, but all I found was silence that seemed to mock my fragility. This inner rupture shook my mindset in ways I never imagined. Because when faith wavers, everything that was once certain becomes doubt. The impact goes far beyond the immediate pain. It infiltrates how we see the world, how we interpret events, how we deal with our own choices. It was then that I understood that a crisis like this isn't just about losing something, but about getting lost in the middle of the journey, without a map, without a compass, without direction. And yet, within that emptiness, there was a strange restlessness, almost as if something were trying to be born from the ruin. A silent force, hidden beneath the tears, insisted on reminding me that the end, perhaps, wasn't really the end. It was in this scenario of pain and questioning that something unexpected began to stir within me. After so many tears and sleepless nights, I realized I couldn't remain just mourning. The emptiness was profound, but it also became an invitation. I knew that if I didn't choose to rise, it would swallow me whole. It was then that I took a hesitant step toward what would be the beginning of a healing process, an imperfect path, full of ups and downs, but essential for me to rediscover myself. The first decision was to seek professional help. Sitting before a therapist and opening my heart wasn't easy. I was afraid of being judged, afraid of hearing that I might have failed in ways I wasn't aware of. But there, in that safe space, I learned to name my feelings. I discovered that my pain wasn't weakness, but a human reaction to a devastating impact. It was like bringing out of the darkness emotions I'd hidden even from myself, and realizing that, once exposed to the light, they no longer had the same power to imprison me. Along the way, I also found refuge in genuine friendships. People who didn't offer me ready-made phrases or try to push quick solutions on me, but simply stood by me. Women of faith who knew how to listen, who understood the weight of silence, and who reminded me, with simple gestures, that I was still seen, still loved. These encounters were like small sparks that rekindled hope within me. It wasn't about grand speeches, but about a healing presence, about feeling that I wasn't walking alone, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. And little by little, my relationship with God also took on a new shape. Not like before, when I relied on rigid certainties, but in a more intimate way, almost like a conversation in the back rooms of my soul. I didn't have answers, and often still didn't have the strength. But I began to realize there was a space to begin again from vulnerability. It was a more honest spirituality, born amid tears and whispers, without masks, without trying to show strength when there was only fragility. This process wasn't linear, nor was it quick. Each step required courage to face truths I'd rather ignore. But it was precisely in this movement that I realized something greater. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's built on daily decisions, on the conscious choice not to surrender to chaos. And the more I allowed myself to immerse myself in this journey, the more I understood that within the pain, there was also fertile ground for profound revelations, preparing me for something I couldn't yet see, but which was already insinuating itself as the next chapter of my life. When I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to what happened to me, something inside me shifted. For a long time, I carried the weight of a cruel label on my shoulders, as if my story could be reduced to a single word: betrayed. This title seemed to shout louder than my own name, as if I'd been swallowed by a narrative I didn't choose. But as I delved deeper into this healing process, I realized there was something greater waiting for me, a mindset shift that couldn't be ignored. Rediscovering my identity was like walking down a hallway full of closed doors. One by one, I had to find the courage to open them, even without knowing what I would find on the other side. I discovered memories of who I was before everything fell apart, dreams that had been dormant, talents I had stifled by believing my role was merely to support the background of someone else's life. It was painful to admit that for years I had suppressed myself in the name of an unrequited loyalty, but it was liberating to realize there was still time to reclaim what had been set aside. In this process, I began to see that my identity lay not in the roles I played, but in something much deeper. I wasn't just a wife, a daughter, a friend, a member of a community. I was someone with essence, with purpose, with value that existed independently of any external circumstances. This revelation brought me unexpected strength, as if the invisible chains that bound me suddenly began to loosen. The shame that had plagued me gave way to a new awareness. I was, above all, loved. And it wasn't a human, fragile love, conditioned by expectations, but a love that sustained even when everything else failed. It was at this point that I realized that true transformation begins when you stop defining yourself by pain and begin to recognize yourself by your essence. I no longer needed to carry a title I didn't choose. I could choose new words to define myself: courageous, resilient, capable of rebirth. This shift in perspective altered the way I saw myself in the mirror, but also how I positioned myself in life. I began to make decisions more firmly, to set boundaries where before there had been only silence, to value small victories that would previously have gone unnoticed. This journey of rediscovery didn't erase the scars of the past, but it taught me that they weren't synonymous with failure. They were scars that told a story of survival, and more than that, of overcoming. I no longer needed to hide my wounds, because they were proof that I had endured something devastating and was still standing. This realization brought not only healing, but also a sense of restored dignity, as if I had rediscovered the Emily who had always existed, but who had been buried under so many layers of pain and silence. And the more I recognized myself in this new version, the more I understood that this renewed identity would be the foundation for what would come next, a solid ground where I could build not only a new life, but also a new way of seeing everything around me. I discovered that my voice, previously stifled by fear and judgment, could be an instrument of hope. What I experienced doesn't have to be just pain, but also a testament to transformation. When we share our wounds, we reveal hidden truths that touch other lives and break imprisoning silences. This journey isn't just about me, but about every woman who has ever felt invisible, lost, or discarded, and who now finds the courage to rewrite her own story without fear of the impact it may cause.